I'm Carol Harvey.
Yes.
I'm a journalist. I live in the marina across the bay, in the Marina District, which is I'm also affected by what happens on Treasure Island. To several of the points that were made here, one, the fact that Halliburton Court and Bigelow Court were never opened up to civilians. When the military moved out, citizens from San Francisco were never allowed to live on Halliburton and Bigelow Court. Yeah, what is that strange?
Back away from the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Stand up regularly. You don't have to lean forward to it.
Okay. The fact that civilians were never allowed to live on these two courts, which turned out to be highly toxic, it's self-evident that someone knew. That, on the face of it, seems to be evidence that someone knew those two sites were toxic. No one was allowed to live there. That is a simple fact.
Okay, so I'm not
So
understanding.
the question is, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, my response is that when the Navy did look into leasing the housing to TIDA, the Treasure Island Development Authority, right? We did so with one precautionary measure. We required TIDA to put in the leases and ensure that the tenants had a no-dig restriction, because we didn't want...
That's not what I'm
Please
asking.
let me finish.
That's
Please
not
let
what
me
I'm
finish.
asking. It's not addressing my question.
Well, please let me finish. The no-dig restriction was because a site investigation had already been done in the CERCLA process, and that site investigation had found contaminants like PCBs and lead in regions, in that region of the island, in areas of the neighborhood. And because of that, to be a safeguard, the Navy put in that precautionary measure. A no digging restriction was a requirement. Now, so to address, and this addresses Catherine Lundgren's question too,
But
because she's...
that's not the question.
Please let me finish. She has repeatedly said, you did know, or you wouldn't have had a digging restriction. Well, I think there's a misunderstanding here. The Navy did know, through a site investigation in the CERCLA process, that there were contaminants there, and there was a no digging restriction put in. What's somehow being confused is, we didn't know the extent at all, right? We didn't get it right, the extent at all, of the radiological contamination in Site 12.
Maybe you'd like to have Catherine come to the microphone, because you're not addressing yourself to my question.
Okay.
You're addressing
So
yourself
please
to her.
restate your question.
Keith, I think it was specifically about Bigelow and Halliburton.
Okay.
Those were
Yes.
part of the original investigations, part of the CERCLA process. So that's one of the
Now,
reasons.
we're talking 1998.
Correct. The investigations for the Navy's environmental restoration program go back into the 80s. So that information was used to determine what was suitable for lease and what wasn't. So if you go back to the original finding of suitability of lease, you'll see everything that was examined at the time to determine if it was suitable for lease or not. Bigelow and Halliburton were not deemed suitable, as well as other
Why
areas.
were they not deemed suitable?
Because of the condition, and if you go to that
The
document...
condition
you'll
meaning
find
that they were radiologically and chemically
No.
contaminated.
No, that they were chemically
various
contaminated.
issues.
Chemically contaminated.
Yes, and that's what I was telling you just now, is that there was a site investigation done with data that had chemicals in it, that we had data to support the fact that we weren't going to lease that part of the property. And we did know that at the beginning. You're absolutely correct when you say that.
And
And we
even
didn't lease that area.
in the early days before the housing was even built, the Navy did do investigations of areas before they were built. But, you know, as time goes on, the standards get more strict.
So the radiological program came along later, Carol, and I think that's where I was trying to say the misunderstanding is. And it's true that the radiological program then came along later, and that's when rad impacted areas came forth, were identified, and that was later in the program.
Well, but it's all the same. Chemically contaminated, radiologically contaminated. It's still unfit for human habitation.
Not necessarily, ma'am. That's not true necessarily.
Carol,
It depends on the
hold it,
letter.
Carol.
That's, okay, Carol. It depends on the levels of the contaminants, where they're found, and so forth. There's a lot of things you have to consider. Certainly, there are contaminants, subsurface contaminants in the neighborhood on that surplus site, right, which do not make it inappropriate to live there. Not all contamination makes something a place where you can't live. If that were the case, then there would be many, many places on the planet where any of us that are living now couldn't live. It all depends on the level, the location, and the exposure or potential exposure pathways for that contamination. And that all has to be taken into account. So like Dave said, if you look at the original finding of suitability to lease document and the documents that fed into that, and they're referenced in it, it was a site investigation, I believe, because that's where we were at in the CERCLA process at the time, then it'll become clearer. And I understand how this is confusing. It's confusing to many people because there's different parts of the program and it's very complicated, and if you don't do this day to day, I understand how anybody could get confused by this. It's not an easy program to follow.
It seems very clear to me that people are living chock-a-block between Halliburton Court, Bigelow Court, very close, and proximity makes a difference. I mean, within feet of these highly toxic areas, people are living. I know one case of a little girl who ran down a sidewalk where they had set up flags indicating radioactivity right next to her home, and her hair fell out. I wrote an article about it.
Well, ma'am, yes you did, and I'm not going to respond to some of the...
And that's right next to Bigelow Court, right next to it. They're living so close to these chemicals, it doesn't seem reasonable not to assume that there's going to be being in that proximity is going to make a difference and affect folks, and in fact, folks are getting sick. This is much longer than the question that I had.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Yeah.
Carol.
Keith? Okay.
Thank you.
Second question?
Your 2 minutes. Your 2 minutes, Carol.
Okay, I'm going to sneak one in because Catherine did, and that is, you've got the siding. It's the siding. You're giving the siding to the housing providers, and that stuff has been in contact with mold and asbestos and chemicals and radiation. Aren't you a little bit worried that the housing providers are going to use them to patch up their buildings and people are going to continue getting sick from that siding, if not just from the mold?
No, actually, I don't have any
You're not
evidence that
worried
would
about
support
that.
that. So I think it's good to go.
Thank you.
Now that's kind of a pathetic answer. There's mold all over that stuff. If people breathe it, seriously, all due respect. All right.